All right, good evening, folks. Just going to ask folks to take a seat. Thank you so much for, first of all, welcome to, our fifth policy talk that we've been hosting since the very beginning. Thank you so much for, volunteering your Wednesday evening to come out with us. I know the humidity is kind of interesting to experience right now. We're going to get started. Really quickly, I just want to invite up our, I'm sorry, MJ, actually, I've forgotten your title. But MJ works in our development department. Is fantastic in terms of reminding us, that FOLAR is it's a member-supported organization. So she's going to come up and say a few words, and then we'll get started with the program. So thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank y'all so much for coming out. I always like to start with a question, and in the mood of policy that we're in tonight, I want to ask, does anybody know how many days we have left until Election Day? Is that what? 34? Yeah, 34. 34. What's your name? Andy has it with 34. Yes, 34 days until Election Day. So always keep that in the back of your mind with everything that we talk about today and with everything you encounter in the next couple of weeks. That is something you should always keep in the back of your mind. It's one of the first things you can do to be a great river steward. Speaking of being a great river steward, we have docent trainings coming up on October 10th and October 13th. So that is a Wednesday and a Saturday. If you know anybody who's interested in becoming a volunteer for FOLAR and becoming a river expert, please, after this, go speak to Liliana. She's back there if she's raising her hand. If you know anybody who's interested in volunteering, ask her about our docent trainings. Finally, as Stephen mentioned, we are a member-supported organization, and we are always looking for fun ways to get people to support us. And so we will be on the rooftop at Eleve in Glendale. This is on Broadway and Akarsh. It's a really weird street, but it's in Glendale, very close. And so Yelp is actually hosting us as a featured nonprofit in October. Only 4 nonprofits got chosen, so we feel really lucky. They are going to take a $10 donation suggested at the door, and all funds come to FOLAR. In exchange for that $10 donation, you get all of the food and drinks you want. We will also be raffling off some tickets to Huntington Gardens, some Lamley Theater tickets, and a bomb bag from Patagonia. So if you are interested in going out that Monday night, it's from 6:30 to 8:30, not too late. You can still get home, go to sleep, whatever. It will be a great way to support FOLAR, and you'll have a fun time as well. Another way you can support, we have our remit envelopes in the back table. They are green and white. They're very pretty. So if you like what you hear today, please feel free to pick one up and hand your donation to any of the staff, especially myself, at the end of this program. Thank you all so much. I will bring our resident expert back to the front, and I hope you enjoy the program. Thanks, y'all.
Can't do better than that in terms of, both talking about our programming, opportunities to support us, and being lively and charming about it. That's MJ, everyone, and we're so happy to have her on the team. I'm certainly happy to have her sort of just start the program off in a really positive way. For just a quick question as well, because I know some of us have been here before, but has anyone not been to a policy talk yet? How many people have not? Okay, so quite a few. That sounds good. Come on, you've seen them. Okay, fantastic. Well, this is Damon's first time as well. We have a great representative from NRDC here who's going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on with the river and the things that have gone on in the past. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Policy at the River is an event to really bring daylight some of the discussions that we at FOLAR have on a day-to-day basis, on a week-to-week basis, on a month-to-month basis, with different experts around different particular issues. Believe it or not, there are many folks who are talking about the river and its relationship to things like water supply, flood control, access and open space. And those are the easy points you would find a connection to, but there are more nuanced discussions that we're having around gentrification, displacement, housing, density, around, equity. There's a whole host of conversations where, we don't have the opportunity to share those with you because they're happening behind sort of closed doors, and they're happening mostly when everyone is at work. And so the Policy at the River event was really meant to daylight those conversations, bring the experts out to you, ask questions, engage in dialogue for you to have the opportunity to talk about it yourself. It's really in the spirit of us daylighting these issues out to the public. Just like we do, bringing access to the river was a crucial element of FOLAR's advocacy and community outreach work. We're hoping that this sort of daylights those conversations for you. So hopefully you'll find this informative. It's a dialogue and it's an exchange. So feel free to, bring up your questions as we talk today. And I mentioned this is the 5th one. We've had a whole host of these conversations that's focused around a theme. And in this theme, community and nature, sort of the river at a crossroads, is formatted a little bit differently than before. Typically, I act as sort of moderator and just ask questions of our expert panel who've been up here, talking about sort of their expertise on a given issue. In this case, we thought it was really, really important because some of the things that are happening right now in Northeast LA around the river, that we sort of bring ourselves into the conversation and really create sort of a call to action. The last 2 weeks, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to that have been talking about the future of the river. There's a lot of, in the last few months, there's a lot of decisions that have been happening about these decades and decades of planning work that are materializing that we think are really, really important for people to be aware of, and we want to bring those to attention to you right now. Because the sort of nuanced conversation and the subtle conversation that people aren't ostensibly talking about is that sort of community values and ecological restoration values are sort of being put at odds right now. All these projects moving forward are grappling with the question of, do we prioritize, benefits to the community? Do we prioritize benefits for the river? Do we prioritize benefits for housing? Do we prioritize benefits for, economic development and jobs? And to us, that's a dangerous, dangerous sort of frame to put around these issues. The virtue of the river, the value of the river is that it intersects these benefits together. The complexity of connecting land issues with open space, with equity, with community health, are that we can't pull these things apart. They need to be in concert with each other. And as you probably hear me say more than once tonight, that complexity isn't a vice. It's something that we need to aspire to address, because that's the only way we're going to make the river a successful project for ecology, for people, and for everyone living around here. So I'll stop there for just a moment. I want to just introduce really quickly, let Damon introduce himself and a little bit about NRDC and the work that he does. And then we're going to get right into some case studies of stuff that's going on right now that we wanted to highlight for you. So thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. Let me introduce myself. My name is Damon Nagami. I am a senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council in Santa Monica. Well, we're a national and international organization. We happen to have a Southern California office, and we have for almost 24-ish years in Santa Monica. And I've been privileged to work with Friends of the LA River for many years now. It is one of our go-to organizations working on LA River issues. We've been working hand in hand on river restoration issues for a while now. My colleague Joel Reynolds has been a longtime river advocate, working with folks like Lewis McAdams and Shelley and others here. See some familiar faces. Thrilled to see Arthur Golding, another face from the cornfield fight, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a minute. But just to tell you a little bit about what I do at NRDC, I am a senior attorney. I work on protecting parks and open space, increasing park equity in Los Angeles and elsewhere, making sure folks in park-poor communities have access to nature, whether it's having more parks in park-poor communities across Los Angeles, increasing open space and green space along the LA River, fighting the administration and Congress when they want to do things like increase fees to national parks. That's another way that access is thwarted for folks who can't get out and see nature the way that many of us can. So it's a little bit about my work. Stephen has asked me to come here and give a little bit of context and background on the cornfield fight. So I'm going to try to do that. I think there are people here who could do much more justice to it, but I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about that fight. Stephen's going to talk about the fight around Taylor Yard and the Coalition for a State Park at Taylor Yard. And then Stephen's going to go in and talk about a development that we all have our eyes on and we have concerns about, the Casitas Lofts project, and what our plans are around that. So, does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So I should just keep going. This is my first policy talk, so I'm just going to muddle my way through it. All right. So we're going back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, when Friends of the LA River, NRDC, and many others were part of a coalition formed to thwart an industrial development at the cornfield site. Now, just to give you some background, and I must confess, I took much of this information from, there's an excellent article by Jan Chatton-Brown and Bill Delvac from the early 2000s about the cornfield fight. And then another article that came out last year that KCET put out that had a really good overview of Chinatown. So I'm sure a lot of you know the background, and some people here could probably recite it from memory. But let me just give the overview. Just to orient us here, the location of the cornfield is there where the red arrow is. It's that long sort of football-shaped parcel just to the southeast of Dodger Stadium. You have a 40-acre parcel sort of nestled in between Chinatown, Solano Canyon, and Lincoln Heights. The river center is sort of that green blur sort of near the top. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Historic uses for this site, the cornfield site. This site was used for rail throughout most of the 20th century and through to the late 1990s. And as you can kind of see it here, this picture was taken around the year 2000. There were weeds, there was debris, there were homeless encampments, and this was a parcel that was in sore need of doing something with it. And you can see, if you've been to the park, the location is just incredible. Just north of downtown, a large parcel that a lot of people had different ideas for. So it became sort of a battleground for a lot of folks who wanted to do different things with it. The city had encouraged a commercial developer, Majestic Realty, to propose an industrial development for the site. And this proposal was 4 buildings totaling more than 900,000 square feet of light manufacturing and warehouse use. And of course, with the promise to create more than 1,000 jobs. But FOLAR, NRDC, folks in Chinatown, and others had a competing vision for a central park for the city with active and passive recreation. And just to sort of take an excerpt from the article from last year from KCET, the groups envisioned a new urban neighborhood that would link Chinatown to the LA River, with picnic areas peppered with trees, soccer fields, baseball diamonds, and a new middle school that would inject life back into a new neighborhood known as River Park. Melanie Winter, the former executive director of FOLAR, has a quote in this article where she says, "We knew that to make anything good happen, we had to make a compelling visual argument." And I think that was key, and that's something we're going to get back to here. It's, when you want to inspire something new and something different and something for the community, it's kind of hard to talk about it in the abstract. So something that was really critical to that fight was having a vision and then getting some really smart and creative people together to make that vision a reality and something that people can see and understand. So I think when we come back to strategies, I think we're going to talk about things like that. So Friends of the Los Angeles River, NRDC, and a broad coalition of community and civil rights activists formed what was known then as the Chinatown Yard Alliance to stop this industrial project that was being proposed. The alliance endorsed a plan to convert the cornfield into an urban park of open space and other mixed uses. And what was really special about this coalition was that it was diverse. It consisted of environmental groups, community groups, and also civil rights groups, social justice groups, all dedicated to turning the cornfield into a public park. You had large environmental groups like NRDC and what was known then as Environmental Defense, or EDF now. You had Chinatown groups, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Society of Los Angeles, which represented the Tongs of Chinatown, like the families in Chinatown, played a role in an important role in the coalition, as well as groups like Concerned Citizens of South Central Los Angeles and others who were sort of in the more social justice space. I'm not going to be able to talk about everything with this campaign, but suffice it to say that the environmental process was less than what many of us had desired, and NRDC and many others brought a lawsuit under the California Environmental Quality Act for failing to even do an environmental impact report. They just felt like it wasn't necessary. There weren't impacts that were significant enough to trigger that requirement. We obviously disagreed and filed a lawsuit. Lawsuit went forward, and on the eve of the hearing, a settlement was reached, allowing the plaintiffs to seek state funds to acquire the land and carry out the vision of the coalition. This is going really fast. We could talk about each facet of this campaign for hours, but I only have like 10 minutes. So there's a settlement. There's a legal settlement. Lawsuit settles. After the settlement, we continue our advocacy efforts to implement the vision of the cornfield as really an anchor for the revitalization of the surrounding communities. A committee was convened, the Cornfield Advisory Committee. My colleague Joe Reynolds was appointed, as many others were, probably Arthur and some others in this room and in this community. It was comprised of a diverse cross-section of community groups, environmental groups, other individuals that met regularly for almost 2 years to provide guidance and input on the planning and design for the state park. So the state has now come in and has acquired this property. We don't know what to do with it. So there was a long process of discussions happening about, you know, what is going to be in this park, what's it going to look like, and et cetera. And go ahead and go to the next slide. To keep this issue in the public, go back one, my bad. To keep the issue in the public consciousness, our friend of the LA River, Lauren Bond, actually turned the site briefly into an actual cornfield. So in 2005, here's a photo. You can't really see it very well, but the Not a Cornfield public art project was able to sort of keep this issue alive for people. To make sure they knew that we were still pursuing this goal of open space for these communities. And go ahead to the next slide. So the park ended up going through some more design changes, and after many, many years, the finished park finally opened last year, as many of you know, 2017. This is a picture of the ribbon cutting with all of our state and local luminaries. I'm not in this picture. I think I'm like up on that hill back there, away from the crowds, watching from afar. But it was a great day. It was a hot and sunny day. But many people had been waiting for this day, and it was amazing to see the people come out for the grand opening of this park. And just to finish this off, the next slide, one of the exhibits that was put up on the day of the grand opening was a really moving tribute to the Chinatown Yard Alliance, with some signs showing some of the slogans and some of the advocacy that was used during when the Chinatown Yard Alliance was pushing for expanded open space, no industrial site on this site, and so this was just a little look back at how we got to where we are at the Cornfield site. So. That's what I have on that site, and now I think Stephen's going to talk about a similar fight that we had at Taylor Yard, another former rail yard site a little bit farther up the river.
Thank you. Let's give Damon just a round of applause really quickly for taking us very, very quickly through that history, which I'm sure was long and probably more sordid than it seems. So I want to have a chance to open up for questions later on, but I also want to carry us through Another example that happened much, much closer to where we are right now, but really in some ways mirrors the same fight that the community had around securing open space and securing sort of access to the river as a sort of fundamentally a community concern. You know, in the face of what typically would be considered to community interests, economic development and sort of jobs. So, well, can you move the mouse really quick? Sorry, it's going to be annoying me if it's there. So this is, everyone's familiar with this image? Does anyone not know where this is? I guess that would be, okay, one person, great. Two people, that's okay. You can, this is totally the opportunity to, for us to ask questions. So what we're looking at right now is sort of looking from relatively where we are. The River Center would be looking at this map probably, it'll be off the screen, somewhere around down here, or much further down. This is the G2 parcel, or we're looking sort of north towards Taylor Yard. And what you notice is that there's a vast empty space of land that's bordered by the LA River and a rail and some infrastructure. You see the power lines next to there. Heavily developed alongside of it. And it really sort of marks what the opportunity is and has been for a long, long time around Taylor Yard. A lot of community interest. It's been, I wouldn't say necessarily plagued, but there's been a lot of planning that's been happening around this site. I want to go through that history really quickly because it'll frame some of the conversations that we're having right now. Just like with everything else, context is incredibly important. And so before we have the conversations about what's happening now, I want to go through this really quickly to see sort of where we are and how we got here. So once again, this is the section of Taylor Yard that we're looking at. Here's some historic photographs that show that actually the development and the rail that existed at Taylor Yards, it was pretty extensive. It actually went right up to the line at San Fernando Road. So some of the subdivisions that you see now and some of the development was part of the subdivision of that property and much, much later on. But originally, a lot of the rail happened right up to San Fernando Road, and it covered pretty extensively that whole area. This is owned by Southern Pacific at the time. When sort of freight was expanding in Los Angeles, it was one of the best ways to move goods and people around. And of course, you know, after in around the 1980s, well after sort of the advent of the freeways and infrastructure like trucking that began to provide alternatives for moving freight around, the site began to lose business interests, and Southern Pacific Railroad began redirecting some of its freight trains towards Cajon Pass, which bypassed this entire area. So over time, just like most of sort of industrial history in the in America, we slowly lost use of this site. This is some images of what it looks like now. You can see some of the same infrastructure. I'm going to switch back really quickly. You can see some of the same infrastructure right around this area is highlighted. You can still see where the buildings were, how that infrastructure sort of shaped the site. And really what's important to think about is that the history is almost left there as, not quite a scar, but certainly it's left its mark on the site. And the proximity to the river and the opportunity to expand that river floodplain, which we constrained so long ago, is pretty clearly evident. So after the Southern Pacific Railroad decided to close down the use of the site, it started looking at opportunities to subdivide the land and begin to sell it for different types of developments. And so this map really showcases, some people have heard G2, some people have heard G1. Those are a reference to the parcels that Taylor Yard, this entire complex, were split up in. One of the first parcels that was developed was the Metrolink Central Maintenance Facility, which is just on the other side of the River Center here. You might hear it tonight, sort of the horns going off. This is a site where Metrolink maintains their trains, and it was met with a lot of community opposition, and even to this day, there's a lot of issues with the continued use of that site, considering there's so many residents right nearby. Later on, some of the other parcels began to be developed. Actually, the FedEx building was one of the early additions to the development of the site. Very early on came interest from the media center, which is over on San Fernando Road, close to the Super King, if people are familiar with that part of the site. That development really sort of triggered some concern around the community, and in fact, it was preceded in many ways by the development of the Metrolink maintenance facility. The community saw that this place was being piecemeal sold off to different interests without sort of a cohesive plan, without a cohesive vision. And considering that this was a prime opportunity to expand public access, expand public access to the river, but as well as parks and open space, there was some concern about what the future of these parcels were going to be and what was the future of the community right next door. So actually, Melanie Winter at the time engaged the development, I believe they were called legacy partners in the development of these projects, to see if they could change the project to be more respectful of the community that was right next door, include some environmental benefits, water treatment features in their facility, and it would actually ended up being somewhat of a amenable partnership. The developers were actually really interested in listening to what the concerns were and how to address them. Later on, let me see if it's there. Nope, that's not it. We'll get there. Later on, we have still other developments went up. Soon after, Nelson Nameplate bought the site that we're actually going to be talking about a little bit later on. In fact, if folks have picked up these flyers, you'll have noticed that we've actually marked off the location in blue here, and this is sort of the Casitas project that we're going to be talking about later on. So just feel free to reference that. As well as the a storage space that was developed up here at the very tip of the parcels. But this development, this one here, if folks have driven along San Fernando Road, this is the joint development project that Metro has taken on that is now a series of housing units along San Fernando Road. They're known as the River Park Development. I'm not sure if folks has anyone driven down San Fernando Road, seen them? Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. Those went up really, really quickly. And in some of that original visioning, while these parcels were being subdivided, there was some interest in different types of development. This project has probably gone up faster than some of the rest of them have. And part of that has to do with sort of the structure of the partners involved in the development. Needless to say, there's been a lot of really interesting ideas about how many different uses you could build into it. One of we think the main beneficial uses has also been the Sonia Sotomayor campus that provides high school education for many, many students nearby in the nearby communities. But the big fight, the one we definitely want to talk about, is around the Rio de Los Angeles State Park. So there was a development company called Lenner that was based in Florida. They weren't local, they were based in Florida. They came and proposed a pretty substantial development, and you can sort of see the difference here in this parcel, which sits right next to what that future development site would be. And they proposed about, it was a 2/3 industrial, about 1/3 retail development. Full transparency here, most of this information I pulled from different sources, but Melanie Winter has a chronology on the evolution of the Taylor Yards at the River Project's website, which I highly recommend you check out. It has really fantastic information, great photos. Some of the photos that we're using are actually from her website, so full credit to her. She led this fight in many ways, and so I think it's important to acknowledge her work in this. Needless to say, after the sort of successful conversations with the media center development up here, the partners who weren't quite a coalition at the time began to talk to Lenner, who we'll reference sort of later on. Their proposal was really sort of agnostic of what the context of the community around it was. Mostly industrial, very, very little retail. They thought the community's interest was in jobs, but what the thoughts at the time were, they were seeing all this development going on alongside of it, and there were this huge swath of land behind the river that was being sort of left over and neglected, and that was an opportunity. There was an opportunity to fight for a parcel that allowed community access to the river, to these other parcels back here called G2 and G1. And so the Coalition for State Parks, for a state park at Taylor Yard, was formed because the partners at the time were unwilling to sort of consider their environmental impacts. They wanted to submit what's called an MND, a mitigated negative declaration. They were essentially saying there are going to be no environmental impacts of this project. And so, of course, as sort of Damon was mentioning before, if, from a legal standpoint, that's a sort of a very bold statement to make. One of the Coalition for State Park at Taylor Yard decided to mobilize around this, and a very similar fashion that they'd done to the cornfields, decided to put together a legal battle against this project, which eventually, mobilized many, many community members. This is some slides again from Melanie's website, the River Project. Their strategy and their tactics, I think, are really important because they're sort of salient to the point that we are right now. It was all about community mobilization at first. Eventually, they got into a legal fight, but at the very beginning, the notion was, where's the community's voice in all this? This proposed development is happening. There's all these different piecemeal developments that are going on in each one of these parcels. Where's the community's voice and where's the community's vision in it? And so they formed this coalition, many, many groups, about 30 different organizations. I couldn't possibly recite the full list, but it was a broad base of community-based organizations, businesses, faith-based organizations, environmental groups, social justice groups, everyone who had an interest in seeing this developed from, instead of seeing an industrial development, turned into a park, it turned into an open space for their communities. Their needs were recreation, their needs were access to open space. And so the community really mobilized in letter writing campaigns to elected officials, several, letter writing, there was media events, there were community events and mobilizing folks, they hosted parades. It was a pretty substantial grassroots effort that really began to sort of change the tone about this development. And on the other end, as we mentioned, there was sort of a preparation for a legal fight as well. Skipping over a lot of sort of interesting, tumultuous times, eventually they won with a couple of really sort of crafty, really innovative tactics outside of the community organizing. What they did do was capitalize on the changing political dynamics of the time. And when the project originally had support from then Mayor Riordan, when his term came up, many of the elected officials saw the community opposition to the project and didn't want to see as being against this community vision, didn't want to see themselves as being against that community voice. So that was one important aspect and context in this fight. The other was that there was, because of the mobilization of Melanie Winter and other groups like FOLAR, elected officials at the time had already set aside public funding to purchase this land. Before this project sort of was cleared, and actually, I'm sorry, the project was actually already cleared by the time this fight took place. They had already secured funding from the state and from local officials to actually help fund the purchase of this site. So when the lawsuit eventually won, because of the mitigated negative declaration not being sufficient to cover the impacts of what this project was going to have, the developer really was told, and the developer in the city were told to go back and prepare a full EAR. The entire context had changed. The political context, the financial context, the community context had changed. And so really they were pressured into selling this land to the state in order to create that park. This is some vision. This is from the city's revisation master plan. And I think doesn't necessarily quite envision what they were. This is not a copy of what they were envisioning, but I think I'd love to point out this image because I think if you go back to, this is the actual, as Damon was saying, one of the tools that they used was visualizing what their vision for what the community's vision for this park was. You can see the park is still here. There's a lot of soccer fields. There's different multi-use fields. The development is still there, but the entire parcel right behind it that's subdivided by the rail line is essentially a braided wetland habitat. That was their vision, and it extends all the way into the bow tie parcel and stopping just short of what was already developed at that point, the Nelson nameplate building. So that entire vision, the whole point of this process, the whole point of those meetings was about community fighting for open space and fighting for, being able to access a restored section of the river. And if we look at it more close up, I would imagine that this sort of visualizes some of what that dream was. So now we get into what the fun part of tonight is. So in terms of sort of community vision, in terms of what's going on right now, this parcel down here we really want to call attention to because this is now being proposed as a 419 development complex that includes, I think it's, out of the 419 units, approximately 35 or 11% of them are very low income. And it's in sort of the bottleneck of Casitas Avenue. It's right next to the 2 freeway. It's in the historic floodplain of the Yellow River. You can see how that sort of is connected to this whole area. And as well as this is a part, as you saw from the images before, that has been slated for wetland recreation and habitat restoration. If anyone has heard of or worked or sort of looked at the issues of flood control, or the Army Corps of Engineers or the Flood Control District, you'll probably know that anytime we think about the impacts of flooding, the very first calculation that's sort of done after you look at sort of what the capacity of the channel is, it's what is the adjacent land? Who are the people next door? What is that land, and what is the vulnerability, and what is the risk? Creating 419 units right adjacent to a space where we're talking about restoring wetlands creates some very, very strong technical challenges and policy challenge in terms of restoring this site. These parcels right now are still being developed. This is the G2 parcel that the city purchased and is now undergoing planning. As we've probably seen in the flyer and we'll mention later on, there's a planning meeting happening tomorrow for that very specific project. So if you're interested in this, I'd certainly recommend you attending that. This park has already been developed, and if anybody goes out there on any given night, you'll see it's heavily, heavily used. Many, many community members attending this area, love attending sort of the active recreation areas, and it includes at the back end a very quiet, very dark, sometimes you can actually hear amphibians and frogs on the other side of the fence, almost a wetland, not wetland, a restoration area. There's actually a lot of really beautiful native plants in that area. And it creates a very, very different experience from the busyness of San Fernando Road to what the future of a restored river could look like in that area. Do we not have the... There should be one more. Okay, well... Sure. So G2 is this, starts right around there. This is the G2 parcel, 42 acres. That's what the city's working on right now that has been purchased. These 40 acres is Rio de Los Angeles State Park that has already been bought. This right here is the Bowtie parcel that is owned by State Parks. And this is the Casitas project that we're talking about right now. So this is not the vision. This is what is there right now. So currently there is a industrial use facility. The company was called Nelson Nameplate. They sold, this development was sold to a developer in New York, Pan Am Equities, and they have submitted this proposal last year, I believe, in January of last year. They held a sort of open house that we attended. And ostensibly, you know, they say they're adding a lot of value to this park development. But considering very little sort of affordable housing, considering the context in the area, what we see is that this project is really capitalizing on the legacy and years of investment in these open space for private gain. And that continues to be the challenge around open space and parks here. When people talk about the river revitalization displacing them or green gentrification, it's because we're making these public investments in these natural resources, and there's a lot of private gain that's happening alongside of them. And so that's something that we're going to be mobilizing to fight around. We're happy to talk about this a little bit more in further detail, but I want to take this moment really quick just to have everyone take a pause. I know I just threw a lot of information at you. But if you have any questions about the historic fights and what these were, to Damon or myself, happy to answer them. And then what I'd like to do is just really open it up to everyone as well to talk about what's the future of this project and what sort of full our role going to be in that. So fantastic. All right, great. How's everybody doing? Yeah, any questions? Yeah, go ahead, Kelsey.
That's a great question. So just to restate, I think the question was, when you have people and people of very different, diverse sort of groups, diverse individuals with different needs and interests, how do you get them to sort of come together in pursuit of a common goal? I think it's something that we come up against in most, if not all, of our fights. I know that FOLAR and NRDC and probably every other group out there understands that you know, together we are more powerful than just any one individual or any one individual group alone. And so what we have to do is find those common threads that bind us together that can serve as the unifying concept that many different diverse types of groups can sort of get behind. And so I wasn't around back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Maybe Arthur can speak to this. If you want to speak to it a little bit, we'd love to have you come up here and answer this type of. But I would say, generally speaking, and in this fight, it was, we don't want an industrial development here in this location. Now, maybe it's because you know, you are upset that the Zanja Madre, the historic water conveyance facility that was used by folks who first came here to settle in the Los Angeles area, was discovered here, and there's a potential threat to those remains. Or maybe your concern is the fact that black and brown people's civil rights are being violated by not having enough park space in these areas because of decisions that were made through institutional racism over many years. Or maybe you're just concerned about gentrification displacement. Maybe you're concerned about river functions being threatened. But if you can come up with that one unifying concept, which is, okay, let's not worry about what's going to happen and what the park is going to look like, and we can fight about all the different uses later. We know we don't want this, so let's all unify and have that be our rallying cry. That's my understanding. I wasn't there. Maybe. So let me introduce, for those of you on camera and those of you in the audience, Arthur Golding, who is an architect and was around for this fight, can tell war stories, could probably sit up here and do this much better than Stephen and I could. So Arthur, it's great to see you.
Thank you. I'll be brief. A lot of networking is how, the question was how, and the how was a lot of networking, and it was principally Lewis McAdams, who's been involved in many issues for a very long time, and of course is the founder of Friends of the Los Angeles River. Lewis drew on his network, and those folks that he contacted drew on theirs. And the other key figure in this is Chi Mui. Chi was a Chinatown activist. He was a deputy to then State Senator Richard Polanco. And Chi had a very extensive contacts in Chinatown, in the Chinatown community. And that was critical because initially people in Chinatown actually, many people, business people particularly in Chinatown, actually favored the warehouse development because they thought, A, it's an eyesore down there now. B, if it's a park, they were thinking city park. They're thinking city parks are not maintained. It will never be maintained. It's going to become a horrible place. And they were really dubious. And she did a lot of jawboning, met with a lot of people. I attended many, many small group meetings with him where we would talk to a handful of people in Chinatown. And Chi, again, had a network of connections through Senator Polanco and so forth, so besides his Chinatown roots. So that, I think, is sort of like a footnote to what Damon's been saying, that you have an issue or a theme or a goal, and then you start to look at who do we know that could help, who might be interested, and then you just keep working it.
Thank you, Arthur. Arthur Golding, people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so Helena, you want to talk about this some more?
Just wanted to add into that because it's so true. We're trying to coalition with neighbors, and it's fortunate. One fortunate thing about this particular location is it crosses over 3 different communities. I mean, it actually sits in Glasso Park, but you have to get there through Atwater. It connects to other things. So we've had 3 meetings now with the developers. Clearly, we're all opposed to it, and we see there's so many major problems with this. But in large part, it's the agreement with you that, this is like this proprietary thing for well-off people. And they're going to be taking up all the space and usage for what should be public use. And the one narrow street that gets you there would block access for everyone else. And in and of itself, creates transportation issues. If they did a full EIR, I think they'd have some serious problems.
Yeah, thank you. So this is Helene Schlack from the Glasso Park Neighborhood Council, and there was the comment before was from Karen Barnett from the Atwater Village Neighborhood Council. I think both the comments that they made, between the access road that Karen brought up, one of the interesting favors that the developer is asking for in terms of meeting some of its transportation requirements is the adjacent parcels that are slated for development as public land. They're asking if they can get a road through that entire strip of land as an alternative access path. And so it, again, sort of begs the question of these public investment, all these dollars. Recently we just passed Proposition 68. That's a $4 billion in a state water and parks bond, 2 million which are eligible from, or is it 2 billion? I think it's 2 billion actually, which are eligible from the city of Los Angeles in competitive grant funding. This funding can be used to create these spaces that have long been a vision of the community. And if this private development is really thinking about taking some of that investment for its own benefit, then I think it calls into question those issues of equity, those issues of what is the context or what is the value that this development is really bringing to the community right next door. And I think, again, sort of the traffic impacts are pretty egregious as it is right now. And I think the thing to drive home here is that all of this happens, most of these process happens because not enough people know about them and because not enough people sort of mobilize. The zoning change that the developer is asking for is essentially what amounts to a favor from the city. The city has to grant entitlements for most of these developments to happen. This is sort of the constant refrain we hear with development and the bad planning in Los Angeles is that, they're done piecemeal. There's entitlements that are granted for one project or another, and instead of really thinking about what's the overall vision, how is this relating to the community around it, and particularly how is it relating to this long-standing legacy that we talked about, these fights, these community members, organized for years and put together a vision and told the city, this is what we want to see, this is what our vision is. And we have that legacy really sort of being co-opted. This is one of those fights that we're definitely going to get involved in. We hope you're going to join us on that.
And I just want to add, we're not being subtle here. We would like to use and learn from the past campaigns and apply them to this situation we have here. So the question about how do you unite people who may have differing views? Well, I think whether it's that you're concerned about that there's only one entrance and exit from the site and you're concerned about traffic, or you're concerned that this is the entrance to the future unified state park that could be 110 acres of riverfront parkland sort of going into Rio de Los Angeles, or you're concerned about building in the floodplain, which is a terrible idea from a planning perspective. I mean, there's something here, I think, for everyone, and if we can just agree that this is not the right project in this location, I think we have the beginning of something here that is bigger than just any one individual or any one group. And that's the only way we're going to get the attention of some of the folks who are going to be making decisions on this project.
Question in the back. Yeah, so the question was, who owns the property now, and have there been conversations with the property owner about perhaps changing the development as it's being proposed? So the property owner currently, it was bought by the developer. I mentioned Pan Am Equities is the current property owner, and they're proposing the development there. We have had conversations a few times now with the local development team, since they are sort of based in New York. They have hired a local team about exactly some of these questions. And we, to sort of be quite frank about it, have been pretty disappointed with the level of sort of engagement that we've had from them, the level of consideration and for our concerns, for the community concerns. Most of the time, they are planning to go through an EIR process, so it's not as sort of egregious as some of the other fights were before. But I think there's plenty to be discussed, and we're certainly open to having those conversations. We want to create a vision that's something that's very positive and moving forward, that creates some benefit. But ultimately, that has to be a dialogue, that has to be a conversation. And part of that is going to be making sure that everyone's voice is heard. It's not just, us as FOLAR saying this is what we want to have, but it's making sure that we have multiple communities, multiple groups voicing their concerns about what this is, what it's interacting with, and how could it be used to really benefit the community. So as far as I know, the business that was there before, Nelson Nameplate, was the business owner who sold it to this developer who was from New York. I have to dig further into that history if you're asking for more detail than that. Yeah, they left. So as far as we know, Nelson Nameplate sold the business because they were moving to, I believe, Austin. Or Arizona, yeah, thank you. So the company moved to Arizona and sold this property. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah, so there is substantial square footage that is set aside for commercial and retail as well. Yeah, sorry, question behind you, Karen, really quickly. Yeah, absolutely. So great question. Thank you for bringing it up. So the question was about, sort of for those who were participating online, was about sort of the term green gentrification, or just gentrification in general. We have seen, and this is not particular to the river, and this has been sort of many parks development, any investment in a community that adds sort of value oftentimes becomes, intentionally or not, a force that displaces the local community that's there, particularly communities who are vulnerable to that sort of economic change. And the question is, how do we sort of, my mind is sort of, how do we reconcile that with the work that we're doing around creating these spaces, creating community spaces, revitalizing the river? It's a tough topic, and I'll give you as honest an answer as I can. This answer was, did anybody hear or attend the River Symposium that happened last week? Is anybody there? Just, okay, a few hands. No. This was at the Autry Museum. So Council for Watershed Health hosted a conversation about the river in general. At the very last panel, and I encourage those who didn't have a chance to attend, it should be viewable online, a whole host of experts talking about a wide range of issues, from the biology to sort of fire, to community engagement, to long-standing visions, to sort of governance around it. It was on Wednesday of last week. It was during the day, yeah. And I got asked, I was on the panel for community engagement, and I got asked the specific question. The question was, introduce yourself and talk about gentrification, which is fantastic. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and I've lived here for many, many years. And being, watching how quickly the community has changed due to some of the investments has been pretty shocking at the speed at which that development has happened. I think it is, to me, gentrification, and of course there's so many different ways to unpackage that term. It's so loaded with so many different meanings for different people. The way I'm referring to it is the gentrification is the ability to potentially displace those communities, particularly communities of color, communities with, who've been underserved and uninvested from, is a symptom of bad planning, and is a symptom of bad inclusion. We haven't done, if there are unintended consequences to the development, to bringing sort of this kind of project, the river, or a community amenity to a community that ends up affecting them negatively, in one way or another, it can be attributed to the fact that their voice is probably not included in that process. And if those concerns are being held or heard from the very onset, these are some of the potential impacts it can have, then it could be addressed through policy, through infrastructure changes, through planning. There could be a way to address those issues if it was a goal and intention of each project. I think the real hurdle it runs into has to be, part of it is regulatory, has to be part of it is planning, is what is the structure of planning, how are we collectively envisioning what the future is, and how we manage that change, that transition from where we are now to where we want to go. That's a complicated, nuanced question that everyone needs to participate and have a voice in for those concerns to be addressed. The other part is quite frankly, we've done an incredibly fantastic job of putting different, how should I say, sort of infrastructure, whether it's the river and the flood control, or whether it's park and park maintenance, into very, very, discrete silos. And so as a jurisdictional issue, there's one agency which manages this issue, there's one agency which manages the other one, and that fragmentation of authority, of responsibility, makes it much, much harder to come together with a cohesive vision. And for our part, and I won't say that we are the best, and we certainly have tried as much as possible where we can to have those community dialogues and have those engagements, we believe it starts with community engagement. We believe it starts with making sure those voices are included, that concerns are being heard, and to the best that we can, knowing we're not planners, we are not folks who can talk about for example, rent stabilization ordinances, but we can certainly hear those concerns and communicate with our partners who are addressing those issues about what are the solutions that we can consider in the enactment of a project. Sorry for going on that sort of long-winded story, and I think just to wrap it up really quickly, I think what I was getting to at the very beginning about sort of the complexity being a vice, it's very easy to see issues that we're not an expert on and to consider the issue daunting. This is way too complicated. I cannot wrap my head around it. There's no way we're going to solve equity across the world. We're not going to get to peace for humankind. So why bother, or why try, or segmenting as much as you can? But I think that really calls attention, and really it's a call to responsibility of, we need to embrace that complexity. We need to embrace that intersection between the river, parks, community, land issues, to really address them, to really address them meaningfully, because otherwise we're going to keep running into the same problems. Sorry for that big speech.
Just really quickly to add, it's a great question. My first response is that I don't think environmental groups or the mainstream environmental movement has adequately addressed the issues of gentrification. And I think we are coming around to it maybe a little bit late, but I think there's an energy around it now to really deal with it, which is refreshing. The second thing I'll say is that one thing that environmental groups, environmentalists can do is broaden our reach and the scope of the types of issues that we work on. I think it comes in fits and starts, but for a long time it was like, okay, environmental groups, stay in your lane. Like, this is what you do, you know, open space, climate change, whatever. But more and more, I think we're seeing that we have to work together with folks that are working on issues that are environmental issues or environmental adjacent. I mean, gentrification is coming up in these places, so we're considering, okay, there's a measure on the ballot to repeal Costa-Hawkins. Is that something that NRDC should weigh in on? I think it is. So we're having that discussion internally so that we can be there in solidarity for our brothers and sisters who are fighting for increased rent control and you know, renters' rights and things like that. Not traditionally something environmental groups would weigh in on, but I think it's time to start breaking down some of those walls. And the third thing I'll say is I'll make a plug for a collaborative that we've been part of for the last couple of years called La Rosa, which is doing some groundbreaking work on addressing green gentrification here in LA. And La Rosa stands for Los Angeles Regional Affordable Open Space and Affordable Housing. So what are ways that we can get creative and try to develop parks and affordable housing at the same time, so that you can sort of build that into the community as you're coming in and trying to, you know, bring amenities, but also alleviate some of the issues around displacement and gentrification. So some exciting work there. It's a really tough issue. I really appreciate the question. I don't have all the answers, but I wanted to sort of throw those out there.
Fun. Okay. Any other questions? Any other thoughts, comments, these projects? Yeah, go ahead, Karen. Yeah.
I think if I may add on to that, it speaks to what you say about greater coalition building. They don't feel a force opposing them yet, that they would be in a position that they'd have to make any compromises.
Well, if we can rally together in the way that we plan to, and that's exactly what we're trying to build, is a coalition that can sort of speak to those voices and add some balance to that conversation. Yeah, question over here.
Thinking about different ways in which we think of nature. Because when we're thinking about the river, we're thinking about unifying factors here and how it affects different classes, different interests, things. And one of the things that I keep on hearing is thinking about like when I think of ecology, I think of social ecology.
Yeah.
And I think of what it makes, these differences, these separations, societally, is often replicated in both the environmental activism that has been present in Los Angeles for a long time. So when you think, you know, just to kind of play on something is, you know, when the tenants union is organizing and they're thinking about their environment, they're thinking about their everyday life environment. And that means coming in, washing dishes, cleaning the house, sending their kids, putting their kids to sleep. And the floodplain of their social ecology is the spaces around them.
Yeah.
And it's when we start actually blurring these lines that we can actually start creating a multicultural, multi-class, multi-conceptual kind of relationship struggle with that. urban cities need with the onslaught of gentrification. Gentrification is where there is care. If you put a community neighborhood garden, a co-op garden, if you put in public transit, there is now, you see the increase of property values. This is stuff that you see in Europe, this is stuff that you see here.
Yeah.
There's multiple studies on these kind of things. How can we care about the urban space without displacing people and still giving people the right of return to the place? That's an LA thing. I've lived in Lincoln Heights, all my life. I was born in County USC, and this is an ongoing thing. And Polar has been caught in the wave of the retake of the middle class of urban cities. This is throughout the whole United States. It's not unique to Los Angeles. So, but I think that we have to think about nature in a very different way.
No, and thank you. I wish I'd given you the microphone for that, because I think you made some incredibly salient comments, and I absolutely agree. I think that blending those lines, as you're referencing sort of social ecology, is incredibly important to, again, sort of breaking down those, I want to say sort of not just institutional silos, but those paradigms of thinking that get us thinking about optimizing solutions for one subset of actors or one subset of constituents versus another. And I think where we are headed, thinking about the issues that are facing us, both in terms of, social factors, like we're talking about gentrification and things that I think are very much rooted in in equity. And similarly, climate change, which is sort of rooted in a long-standing symptom of our use of natural resources. I think we have to consider these interdependent and interlinked, and the solutions for them are really going to require a different kind of thinking. So that's why I think as sort of referenced before, and in a sort of small reference to sort of the social justice movement as well, is we have to think about how do we become allies and how do we integrate solutions with each other, and how are we hearing and learning from perspectives, because we have certainly been, I would say, sort of as an organization and as an environmental movement, as Damon brought up as well, we're trying to shift that modality, and it's incredibly difficult to do it within an organization, within an institution that is about advocacy. So I can only imagine how difficult it is for agencies who are supposed to enact those policies, for elected officials who are supposed to enact those policies, how paradigm shifting that must be for them. But again, I think that's a challenge that we have to face. I think that's what our responsibility is to find the solutions to those questions. But thank you for that. I really appreciate that comment.
So first of all, thank you both for giving us the great history as far as sort of how we got to where we are now, and the work of previous, maybe even almost the previous generation. Sorry, Art. In terms of the work that brought us LA State Historic Park, Comunidad de Los Angeles, you've also done a hell of a good job of scaring us about the prospect of 420 units at the Casitas parcel. So, assuming that we've come along with you and we're equally concerned,
Yeah.
Are you comfortable talking to us at all about sort of what you envision as the path forward and how the folks in this room can help out? Great segue.
Yeah. No. This is your. Yeah. It's like you knew where we wanted to go. So the question was, we've talked about this movement, we talked about the history, we talked about sort of a little bit of what's at stake, and the question is, so what do we do now? And that's, I think, so there's a reason why these events are up. First of all, if you have this flyer, you'll notice that we've included some pretty important action items on there, which is, and this is of course going to be, it's going to sound silly, but sign up, speak up, stand up. This is our opportunity, our obligation to participate, sign up to find out more information, join our coalition that's going to be mobilized around these issues, talking to our neighbors, trying to make sure that we include as many voices, because what we want to do is build a community presence that reflects the community, so that when an EIR gets released, and sort of this is hinting at what we're really looking at, when that environmental document says, here's our full accounting of what some of the impacts will be, we are ready as a coalition, as a community, as a river advocacy group, as a community advocacy group to mobilize and say, this is what we think the vision should be. this is what the community is looking for. This is something that reflects sort of the true vision. And so we're going to be going on that journey, and we hope that you'll join us for that. MJ did a fantastic job pointing out the docent training that's coming up. If you're interested in finding out more about this and what we're going to be doing, join us for that. So on October 10th, which is a Wednesday, and October 13th, which is next Saturday, we're going to be going into further detail on this. We're going to be talking more about what are those concrete steps we're going to take. What are those? It just permeates our language. And language is so important. It's so important. Very discrete, specific steps we're going to be taking around this development. And sort of there's, as I mentioned, tomorrow, there's a conversation happening about G2 right here at the River Center from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Come participate. Tell your neighbors. Tell the people that you know, people in your circle. These are conversations that are happening, and they need to hear from the community. They need to hear from us. What are our values? These projects are being shaped right now. So these are just some of the few, again, sort of supporting FOLAR by going to the Raise the Roof event. It's incredibly important, supporting our organization, supporting others right next door in your community that are trying to get some of this work done. We can't tell you enough. Nonprofits are constantly, I heard Mark Lopez from East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, said it so succinctly once. When they were asking about, can community advocates and community organizations really participate in this long process sustainably? He said, we're used to being under-resourced and overburdened. That's what we do. And the best support that we have are community members joining us and supporting that effort. Sorry, go ahead, Damon.
So I just want to add that I am so excited to see all of you here, and I'm also grateful that you've come out and shared your time and learned a little bit more about this fight and the other fights that we've had. I mean, it's an ongoing struggle to try to do what FOLAR and NRDC and other groups are trying to do. This is a decades-long process. We're kind of in the middle of it, and there are sort of twists and turns, and now we've got this new fight. And this type of gathering, this is how it starts. Like, I'm excited because this is the beginning of something. The Chinatown Yard Alliance, the Coalition for a State Park at Taylor Yard, those all started from meetings like this. I mean, this is where the sort of uprising and the coalition building and the networking and the campaigning sort of strategizing all begins. So thank you for coming out. I'm just thrilled to see all of you, and I hope to see you again as this fight moves on. And just know that the rhythm of campaigns, it's like up and down. Sometimes there's a lot of stuff happening. Sometimes there's nothing happening for a little while, but we will try to keep folks informed. So that's why it's really important. The sign up is really important so that we know you're interested. And everyone gets busy. We know you're not going to be able to come to everything, but so that you can just stay involved and stay informed as to what's going on is probably the best thing. The best takeaway and the best next step we could ask for from anyone who's here tonight.
I think, yes, and back. Yeah, so the question is, what's the next step? Who's the next authority? What's the sort of next milestone in the development of this project that we have an opportunity to intervene or comment on or influence and shape? So the very next one is the release of the EIR. So when the environmental impact report, and it's a very sort of technical term, so we usually shorten it down to EIR. We love our acronyms. That's why we need folks to be informed about when that's going to happen, to know as much as possible. Come to some community trainings, come to the docent training to find out what are those steps we need to do in preparation for that. Because when the EIR gets released, there's a public comment period that is mandated by that says the public gets to review this for, typically it's 30 days. We have the opportunity, the first thing we want to do is ask them to extend that period. We want to make sure we have as much time as possible to have people comment on that. So the EIR is going to be when this thing kicks off in full swing, and everything we do between now and then is going to be about getting us comfortable, getting us prepared for that moment. I want to add to that as well. There's plenty between now and then. We need to have as many voices because we need to put together, as was referenced before, one of the most powerful tools in communicating an alternative to these projects was putting together a common vision. We have different versions of those. We have the communities that have been putting together and fighting for that site, but we need to do that now as well. It's been many, many years since we've engaged in this project, and we need to have a concerted conversation about how do we address emerging issues in the site now. We know what the long-term vision is. How do we make sure that gets included, and how do we move forward with it? So getting informed, staying involved is going to be important, and then when the EIR gets released, we're going to let everybody know to be sure when that happens. Our best guess, and this is the funny thing, as you were mentioning, sort of campaigns can be up and down. We have no control over when that's going to happen. We try to stay in communication as much as possible, but our best guess is that it's going to be sometime at the end of this year. So pretty soon, yeah.
Who is the council person where procedures fall into, and what's their take on it?
What a great question. So the question is, who is the council member for this where this project is happening, and what is his take on the project? Their take on the project. We shouldn't make assumptions. The council member for this area for that project site is Councilmember Gil Cedillo for Council District 1, and I mean I won't mince words here and say it's, you know, we've had conversations with him. I think he's like most elected officials who are trying to balance multiple issues, is looking at the projects without a little bit maybe agnostically and maybe even favorably in terms of what are the benefits it can bring. We know that developments in the community are one of his sort of long-standing interests. He's very sort of interested in seeing more housing, for the sake of the community. I think that presents an interesting challenge, an interesting question in terms of, how do we make sure we're not going to the same tools in the toolbox to understand what the best use in this site is. And it's going to take some meaningful, some very sort of tough conversations, some honest conversations with the council member. So that's sort of what we know is, this Councilmember Gil Cedillo is a local council member. And certainly, we're going to be engaged in conversations about what we think the community's values are. Because again, as I mentioned, the entitlement process, developers asking for favors from the city. We're trying to get the zoning change happen. And just for, changing the zoning, the value of that property goes up immensely. And so the question to the council member and to the whole planning process becomes, is that something that's given to them for free? Is that something that we can simply give away without making sure that there's a benefit to the community for? Yeah.
So I just want to go back to the other question about the process, because I don't think we were planning to get into great detail about, the idea is to sort of give you an overview about the project, the history of the fights, and there will be more information coming. We'll probably do more, we'll have more ways to learn more about the process and the project, but at a high level, the environmental impact report is the document that the lead agency prepares that talks about the significant impacts that a project can have on the environment. And the lead agency in this instance is the City of Los Angeles. So the city planning department is the department that is sort of working with the developer, getting information from the developer about the project, and doing the analysis of, what are all the environmental impacts that are going to take place as a result of this project as proposed. So they've submitted this project, and what impacts is that project going to have on the environment? Once the draft environmental impact review report comes out, that triggers a comment period where we, the public, have to get our comments in and say, okay, we've read your report. This is what we have to say. Like, that's wrong. We don't believe you on this. You haven't shown your work enough on this thing. et cetera, et cetera. And we'll be doing that for sure. We'll be working with community groups, individuals, and encouraging you to write your own comments. All comments are valid and important. A technical comment is just as important as a more general but heartfelt comment from the community. Like, I oppose this project because da 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 da. Not only because you're going on the record and you're sort of part of this environmental process, but also because you're registering how you feel to your elected officials and others who are going to be watching for what constituents and observers and LA residents think about this project. So that comment process is critical for that purpose, but also because it's only interested parties who comment on the draft environmental impact report who are able to say later that they were on the record if it comes to litigation. So if you didn't comment during the comment period after the draft DIR comes out, then the courthouse doors are blocked to you. So. Go ahead, Carrie.
Might you guys have maybe a workshop or something like that to help the community know how to comment? Because from what I understand, there's ways to inspire answers versus a way of just getting noted.
Yeah, good, go.
So the question was, can there be a community workshop on how to write CEQA comments? We can certainly, I don't want to make any promises. I'm on camera, I don't want to make any promises here, but I think that's something we can definitely consider, and yeah, we can do that.
Certainly that's one of the things that what we are aiming to do. So we're definitely going to be talking about that.
That's a really good question. So the question is, is this project in a planning document in the city, and can we use that as, would that status help or hurt our arguments? It's a really good question. Kind of gets back to what Stephen was saying before, that the status quo of planning in the city of Los Angeles is a complete lack of planning. I think the mayor and the city council have finally kind of understood that, and they've undertaken this effort to redo or do for the first time in many years or decades community plans for the entire city. But that implies that, okay, there are going to be these new community plans coming out. The ones that have been done are mostly really outdated, and I don't know if you've looked, but I'd be surprised if anything spoke to this particular site, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and the only thing I would say in terms of our familiarity becomes with the river restoration and the revitalization planning efforts. Most of the margins stop right at the property line for the planning on that site. But we do know from previous documents, including the city's own revitalization master plan, there's several call-outs to some areas were not suitable. In fact, in sort of that fight that we're talking about, the Coalition for a State Park at Taylor Yard, many of the feedback and the input for community was this is not a suitable place for development. That was specifically called out, and it's actually referenced in the city's revitalization plan. But as sort of mentioned, the question becomes how much leverage does that actually buy us? How much sway does that actually create in terms of zoning for that specific site? It's not a clear sort of question to answer, but again, it's going to be something that we're looking at to navigate that question.
I just wanted to say about community plans. So, we're all in Northeast, which is like 12 communities, and we have a schedule for updating community plans.
Yep.
We're last. It used to be 12 years out, and then they decided to move it up, and now it's 10 years. So all of this stuff
The question is, what are they gaining from this? It's hard. We can make guesses. We can sort of make assumptions. But I think at this point, that takes in sort of an honest amount of conversation and dialogue, and a willingness to sort of share that information as well. And it's tough to always to have that sense of trust and have that sense of openness. Sometimes with the city itself, and agencies, never mind, someone who's looking to develop a property in terms of what it's for. Yeah, I think we're getting it's a lot more questions than I expected, quite honestly, for a Wednesday night. But I really do appreciate everyone's sustained engagement. So I think we have time for one more question really quickly. I think I saw a hand over here. Yes.
Oh, I was reading your concerns about the Casitas
Yes.
project, and forgive me for being dense, but I don't. Can you explain what's your concern about it being freeway adjacent? I just understand which way that cuts.
How would I? The adjacency to the freeway, I think, is an issue because we have decades of research that demonstrate adverse health impacts to communities next to freeways. Vehicles, Los Angeles, most of the basin sits in what's called a sort of non-attainment zone for air quality, meaning we struggle to actually counterbalance the impact of our infrastructure built for cars with the communities that are living right adjacent to them. And so studies over studies have shown that the health impacts of the communities next to the freeway are substantial and usually economically, racially, underserved. There's a lot of correlations to that. So I think it reflects a very sort of old idea in terms of planning. And so I think there's some concerns for, is this something that we continue to do? Is this something that we're just continuing to build on? Is just this notion that, because our infrastructure is so, it's everywhere, that, it's seemingly okay just to continue to potentially exacerbate the problem. And so that, I think, are concerned, and I'm happy to sort of hear input from anyone else as well, from Damon. But for me, and speaking as someone who actually grew up watching a 105 freeway being built in my community and spent many, many years right adjacent to it, the sound of cars passing was what put me to sleep at night. And learning very much in college that, one of my thesis projects, my capstone project in college was, the lung capacity of children going up near freeways can go down as much as 15%. Meaning every breath I'm consuming, less air than less processing, less oxygen than someone who grew up in an area not next to a freeway. And so it's just, reflects bad planning and bad design.
Yeah, and I just want to add, it's not just a full R thing. It's not just because Stephen did his thesis. But, I mean, the research is there. And we had colleagues who were working on this issue, and there's science out there to suggest that 300 meters from a freeway, you need to be at least 300 meters away. And if we can change policies so that new housing isn't built within that range of freeways in Los Angeles, we'll have better health outcomes. Now, I look forward to the day when we have EVs on the road, and then we don't have to worry about this anymore. And maybe then we can get back to citing housing within that range. But right now, it's just too risky for health reasons.
Yeah, thank you.
There's also the on-ramp literally goes right by that property. So there's you couldn't cut through and make another entrance to that site. It's just landlocked. It's completely landlocked.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for participating in this engaging discussion. Again, I sort of want to leave you with a positive note, but a note of hope for action. Participate with us. Sign up, find out more, tell your neighbors, tell others about this process, what's happening. We're going to be mentioning more information. Go fill out a comment card at the very end of the table. We're actually taking comments right now because we want to make sure that these are mentioned to our elected officials in terms of what the community's values are. And thank you so much for spending time with us. And please give a hand of applause to Damon for participating in this. And to yourselves for spending so much time with us. Thank you so much. Sorry. MJ, did you want to say one last thing? MJ? What's that? Oh, yeah, so flyers are in the back for some of these upcoming meetings. Just a reminder, flyers are in the back, sign-up sheets are in the back. You can find much more information about these meetings that are coming up. Thank you.